Catalan Course game number 4. In this game, we're going to talk about how to play active with the pieces instead of being over aggressive with the pawns. It's a common theme that I see in a lot of players' games, and it's something that I fell for in this game. Played too actively with the pawns too aggressively. So bishop to d2. In the course, we do recommend knight b to d2, but there's going to be a lot of similar themes, so keep that in mind. We're here to kind of show you what the different themes are. So pawn to c5, g3. Bishop takes b4 is more precise here. I talk a little bit about that in the text if you want to check that out. Okay, so everything gets developed. My opponent's playing d6. And the idea here that you'll see oftentimes in the Bogo-Indian is black wants to keep that light square bishop open by putting their pawns on dark squares. So usually what we'll see is the c pawn back on c7, and then the pawns will be c7, d6, e5. In this case, my opponent already has the pawn up on c5, so it looks a little bit funny to have this structure, kind of this V shape. So what black is trying to do is actually transpose this into sort of like a Tarrasch structure by putting his pawn on d5. So after knight to c6, because I saw that d5 move coming, I played pawn to d5 myself. But this is an over-aggressive pawn move, right? I still have both rooks to get into the game. I should move the queen off the d file, and I would like to move this knight again. So it doesn't make as much sense here to play e4, as in, for example, the closed Catalan. So what I should have played here is knight to b3, applying extra pressure to this c5 pawn, getting ready to clear the queen out of the way, and bring a rook to the d file. So keep that in mind. You want to play actively with the pieces, not always pushing the pawns. I played d5 here, and after e takes, c takes, now we get sort of this Benoni structure, where black has these two pawns, and I have these two pawns. But there's a lot of play for black, and the weakest pawn on the board is arguably the pawn on d5 because it's already attacked by the knight. So he grabs it right away. So now I'm a pawn down, played very actively. My opponent's rated 1807. So I need to be careful here. I might lose this game just down a straight pawn. I don't have much compensation at all. So here I play knight e4, trying to get the pieces active. Knight to g5, targeting this bishop, targeting h7. But my opponent plays well. He's cool under pressure, brings his rook to the center. Now I take. This is a simplification move. I think I almost have to play it though because these are superfluous knights. And what is my knight really doing on g5? Not much. So I was thinking here, if I can take e6 and force f takes e, now I can maybe create a new weakness in the position. So I always want to think about those imbalances, think about weaknesses. This is a potential weakness, the pawn on e6. That's why I'm capturing here. If black were to capture back with the queen, now I have knight g5 and there's a double attack on this knight. This is close to winning because after the queen moves, I can take, guard the knight. There is knight e7 here, and I can play queen takes b7, picking up more material. So that's an almost winning position for white. So my opponent had to take with the f pawn. Now I'm thinking, how can I work at this new imbalance? It's a new weakness. I play queen to b3. See how she's targeting this pawn, same diagonal as the king, and targeting b7? These types of moves will encourage your opponents to make mistakes. He plays knight e5. Here I play f4. This is a bit over aggressive, and there's a very strong reply for black, which my opponent found, on to c4. So one thing to think about here is what should I do instead? I think moving a rook to the center, like rook to c1, maybe even rook to d1, that makes the most sense. Maybe even knight to d2, knowing that this push is coming, because the knight will guard the square on c4, and it opens up my bishop. We want to play active with the pieces here. Black is doing a great job staying ahead in development. Already got both rooks active. That's what's hurting me. I need to get my pieces in the game. So I play f4, c4, strong move. Get my queen out of the way. At this point, I thought knight to g4 would be played. It was the best option for my opponent, creating some problems. He played knight to d3. This is still a good move. Just parking that knight in my camp on the third rank, and that knight is eyeing all of these squares. And this knight is already eyeing e3. So I played queen takes a7 here. I think it's the strongest move, but I have to give my opponent a lot of credit. He's playing really well, and we're already looking at a 2-point advantage for black. So gaining this pawn puts us back at equal material. I think that does put a little bit more pressure on my opponent to prove that he still has an advantage without being up the pawn. So that's something to think about too when you're thinking of imbalances. If your opponent has a better position and maybe you have a chance to snag a free pawn, put more pressure on them to prove that they have dynamic advantages instead of just material advantages. Sometimes that extra pressure on your opponent can cause them to make mistakes. So that's what I'm doing here, grabbing that pawn. On the very next move, my opponent makes a mistake. He plays pawn to b6. The reason this is a mistake is I can trade queens and then target these weak pawns that I've been trying to create this whole time. So what my opponent should have played is knight to c5 here. And after knight takes c, d takes c, this looks strange doubling the pawns, but look at how solid everything is for black. Black is more active. That knight's a monster on d5. He's doing a great job. His queen's ready to come into the game. I'm definitely struggling here, even though the material's even. So he plays b6. I get the queen trade, and now bishop to h3. So now I'm ready to go to work, trying to create some threats. We're at move number 20. Coming up here on moves 23 and 26, I have a couple positive takeaways that we'll talk about. Knight f5. Bring my knight to g5, creating another threat. Maybe looking at e4. Rook f6, and I play e4. It's a bit of a mistake. Knight takes e6 was stronger, but it actually sort of simplifies into a draw after all the trades. So e4 might have been a better practical chance in terms of trying to win the game. But knight takes e6 was the better stockfish move. Knight to d4. So these knights are both eyeing a lot of important squares around my king. I have to watch out for this stuff. And look at that control. All of those red squares are highlighted by the knights on the orange squares. Rook to d1, pawn to e5, b3. Oh, and I should say back on here, move 23, rook a to d1 here. This is an essential move. It brings a rook into the center. I needed to get those rooks developed. And now once these knights are kind of lined up with my rook, now I can look to play moves like b3, knight f3, get the knights off of those strong squares. e5, b3, knight e2 check. This is a small mistake. King g2. And now my opponent makes a blunder. Pawn to c3. It might look obvious that I can just take the knight, but it did require a little bit of calculation so that I was sure that it worked. And I found that I was fine here with rook takes because I have bishop to e6 check, knight to f7 check, trade, and then rook to d2. I know I'm up a bishop in the end, so I'm fine with that sacrifice. In the resulting position, I'm +1 on material. The knight is stuck on c1. So in a couple moves, I think I will be rounding up this knight. Okay, the knight can take b3, but I win d6. Now it's +2 on material, and I went on to win this position with pawn to e6. All right, so main takeaways. I was in some trouble early on. Going back to move 9, sacrificing this pawn was not a great idea. I should have played knight b3, played with the pieces. Move 16 was the next major takeaway. I played f4. That's definitely over-aggressive. I should put a rook in the center. So again, keep the pieces active. Always err on the side of using your pieces before your pawns, unless it's a thematic move like playing pawn to e4 in the closed Catalan where you just know it needs to be played. But then later on, moves 23 and 26, I did a good job playing actively. So right here, rook a to d1, getting a rook into the game. And then coming up here on 26, rook takes d3. That was the active move. I called my opponent's bluff. You don't want to play a move here like knight e6, just kind of ignoring that threat, because then c2 is coming, and black is actually in pretty good shape. It's close to equal, and I might even lose that position. So calculating out that that tactic worked was definitely a positive takeaway. All right, that's game number 4. We'll see you guys in game number 5.